In 1991, a Milwaukee police officer responded to a call about a disoriented man wandering the street. The man was bleeding, confused, clearly in distress. The officer returned him to the apartment of the man who said he was his roommate. The man who answered the door was calm, polite, cooperative. He explained that his friend had too much to drink. The officers left. The man they returned was 14 years old. His name was Konerak synthesomphone. He was dead within the hour. But this video is not about that night. It's about the question that no one who studies this case can fully answer. What was Jeffrey Dahmer actually trying to do? And why did he believe it would work? Because the answer, when you find it, is not what you expect. It is not rage. It is not hatred. It is something far more human and far more terrifying for exactly that reason. Jeffrey Dahmer was described by his teachers as quiet, intelligent, funny sometimes. He had a specific humor, dry, observational, that made people laugh in spite of themselves. He also had almost no friends, not because he was hostile, not because he was strange in any visible way, but because something in him never quite connected. He watched people interact the way someone watches a foreign film without subtitles, aware that something meaningful is happening, unable to fully access it. His parents' marriage collapsed when he was a teenager. His mother left. His father moved out. For a period, Dahmer was alone in the house, entirely alone, for days at a time, at 17 years old. Forensic psychiatrists who later interviewed him described this period as the hinge point, not because abandonment causes violence. It doesn't, not on its own, but because of what Dahmer did with that abandonment. He didn't get angry. He didn't act out. He went very, very quiet, and he began to construct an interior world that no one else could enter, and no one else could leave. His first murder happened 3 weeks after his high school graduation. His parents had just finalized their divorce. He had no plans, no college, no job. He picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, 19 years old, on his way to a concert, and brought him home. They drank, they talked, and when Stephen said he needed to leave, Dahmer hit him with a barbell. He later told investigators, "I didn't want him to go." That sentence, 4 words, is the key to everything that followed. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer killed 17 people. But what forensic psychiatrists found when they reconstructed his behavior was not a pattern of predation, it was a pattern of desperation. He went to bars. He approached men. He was, by most accounts, socially awkward but not threatening. He bought people drinks. He listened. He was genuinely interested in the people he spoke to, genuinely, in the only way he knew how. And then they would try to leave. And something in him, some circuit that most people have, and Dahmer did not, would fail to allow it. The warmth of the connection, the temporary end to the silence inside his apartment, the feeling of not being alone. He could not let that end, so he made sure it didn't. Psychiatrist Dr. Dietz, who evaluated Dahmer extensively, described his motivation with a precision that is difficult to forget. Dahmer wanted companions, not victims. Companions, people who would stay, people who could not leave. The violence was not the point. The violence was the solution to a problem that had no other solution in his mind. He attempted, at various points, to keep his victims with him in ways that went beyond violence. He drilled into skulls. He injected acid. He tried to create, and I want you to hold this thought because it changes everything. He tried to create people who would never want to leave, people who were permanently, physiologically incapable of choosing to go. This is not the behavior of someone who enjoys suffering. This is the behavior of someone who is terrified at a level so deep and so broken that the only solution he could construct was permanent. He was not trying to destroy people. He was trying to keep them. Apartment 213 of the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee looked, from the outside, exactly like what it was. A small, one-bedroom apartment, neatly kept, a television, a couch, boxes of cereal in the kitchen. The neighbors noticed the smell. They noticed it for months. Dahmer told them it was his refrigerator, that meat had spoiled. Most of them believed him. One neighbor, Pamela Bass, said she had become almost used to it. He was always polite, she said. He would hold the elevator for you. What investigators found inside that apartment, after Tracy Edwards escaped in July 1991 and flagged down a police car, was a space that had been constructed with a specific and terrible logic. Photographs arranged, objects kept, an altar of sorts, built from what remained of the people Dahmer had tried to make permanent. Dr. Judith Becker, one of the psychiatrists who evaluated Dahmer before his trial, said something that I think about every time I consider this case. She said, "He was the loneliest person I have ever evaluated. Not dangerous, lonely, just lonely." As if the basic human mechanism for connection had been installed incorrectly, and everything he did afterward was an attempt to fix it with the wrong tools. He was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and necrophilia. But the diagnosis that appears in almost every forensic evaluation, the one that psychiatrists kept returning to, was the simplest: severe attachment disorder, a fundamental inability to form and maintain human connection, and a terror running beneath everything else of what life felt like without it. When Jeffrey Dahmer was finally arrested, he cooperated fully. He confessed to everything. He provided details that investigators had not asked for. He drew maps. He reconstructed timelines. He answered every question. And in the interviews that followed, with investigators, with psychiatrists, eventually with journalist Stone Phillips, in a prison interview that aired in 1994, he said things that no one had quite expected. He said, "I carried it too far, that's for sure." He said, "I knew I was sick or evil or both." He said about the men he killed, "I wanted to see if it was possible to make a person where they would be just a permanent part of my life." That last sentence, a permanent part of my life, not a trophy, not a conquest, a part of his life, as if what he had been trying to do in the most broken and irreversible way imaginable was simply not be alone. He was sentenced to 957 years in prison. In November 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate. He was 34 years old. In his final interview, he had said, "I don't care if I live or die at this point." The psychiatrists who had evaluated him were not surprised. They noted that his cooperation after arrest, his detailed confessions, his apparent lack of concern for his own fate, all of it was consistent with someone who had finally nothing left to protect, no interior world to guard, no connection to maintain, nothing to keep. I want to be precise about what I am and am not saying here. I'm not saying that loneliness causes violence. It does not. The overwhelming majority of people who experience profound isolation, and there are more of them than any of us would like to believe, never hurt anyone. What I am saying is this: Jeffrey Dahmer is the most extreme documented case of what happens when the need for human connection exists without any functional means of satisfying it. When the drive is there, ancient, biological, insistent, and the tools to act on it normally are not. When every attempt at closeness ends in loss, and when the mind, broken and desperate, begins to construct solutions that no healthy mind would ever reach. The question this case leaves behind is not about Jeffrey Dahmer. He is gone. His victims are gone. The question is about the architecture of loneliness itself, about what it does to a mind over time when it goes unaddressed and unseen. Glenda Cleveland called the police 3 times that night in 1991. She told them something was wrong. She told them the boy was not safe. She was not believed. The most dangerous thing about this case is not what Dahmer did inside apartment 213. It is how invisible he was outside of it. How ordinary, how easy to overlook. If you want to understand more about the psychology behind the cases that define our darkest history, subscribe. Every week, one case, one mind, one pattern, and always the same question underneath: how does this happen? And what does it say about us that it does?